Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
In time. Good morning. Good morning. All right, thank you. I'm Claudette Whiting, and I'm a Senior Diversity Director for Microsoft. And I really want to just welcome you here and thanks everybody for taking the time out of their busy schedules for being here. This morning, though, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Abigail Stewart of the University of Michigan. And she is a true expert in her field. And she spent several decades conducting exceptional research on women, their lives, their personalities, careers, and advancement. And so the knowledge and the experience that she brings to us today will undoubtedly be supportive to our own diversity initiatives. You know, we continue to seek active ways to really advance the women at Microsoft. And so I'm sure that Dr. Stewart will provide us with some new ideas and some innovative best practices. So again, thank you for coming today. And I also want to thank Bob Moglia for arranging to have Dr. Stewart be here today. You know, he was so passionate. I mean, he'd heard her speak before, and he'd heard about her research and her work, and he was so passionate about having her come to Microsoft and to share some of her expertise and real-time experiences with us. I also want to recognize that Bob is going to be at some of the additional meetings, because there are a lot of meetings that are taking place with Dr. Stewart today. She's got, you know, at least four other meetings with employees and people across the company to share her information. But I also want to recognize that Bob's not here, but Bob's wife is here today. So welcome, okay? Welcome, and thank you for coming. You know, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Stewart, sort of to set the stage for her talk. Currently, she is the Agnes Inglis Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. And, you know, I caught her in the back and I said, you know, what does that mean? Who was that? And she said, you know, we name our professors at the University of Michigan. And so when she comes up here, it's a delightful story, and I do want her to share that story with you. She is also director of the University of Michigan's ADVANCE project, which is supported by the National Science Foundation's Transformation Studies. This project really is aimed at improving the work environment for women, faculty, in science and engineering. And I don't know how many of you have saw the recent report at Harvard in terms of what they're doing to improve the advancement of women at Harvard. But she is also playing a key role in helping them with that. And so her work is just extraordinary, and it stretches, you know, and has no boundaries. Before joining the University of Michigan faculty, Dr. Stewart was on the faculty at Boston University. And she was also the founding director of the Henry A. Murray Research Center at Radcliffe. She holds degrees from Wellesley University, the London School of Economics, and Harvard University, where she earned her doctorate. Her contributions to the University of Michigan have been recognized by many awards, including the Henry Russell Lectureship, and that's the highest honor the University of Michigan bestows to its faculty. And she has received many other external awards. I could really go on and on about her accolades. She has published many scholarly articles, several books focusing on the psychology of women's lives, personalities, and how they adapt to social changes. So as you can see, Dr. Stewart has an outstanding career filled with many accomplishments. And so we're so fortunate to have her with us today. So it's my honor to introduce her. Let's give her a warm Microsoft welcome.
That was a warm welcome. I can't imagine a warmer welcome. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and a little intimidating because despite what you've just heard, I feel like you are the experts. You know what I'm going to talk about might or might not be pertinent to Microsoft. So I am looking forward to an opportunity to hear from you what's pertinent and what isn't about what we're doing at Michigan to your world, and what you have to tell us about what we're not thinking about. So I'm very pleased about that. I don't want to fail to answer Claudette's request that I explain my title. We're asked when we are given these professorships to choose the name of a distinguished faculty member who we want to honor from the past, who we want to honor or recognize by having them be a collegiate professorship. And so the professorship is named independent of you as an individual. So it persists once you're no longer with them. And when I researched who was an interesting or significant woman faculty member, Agnes Inglis came to my mind because she was an archivist who worked in the university library for 40 or 50 years, building what is called the Labadie Collection. It's a special collection of materials from movements for social change over the 20th century. It is an enormously significant collection for scholars. It's used every day by many scholars, and she did this work unpaid. So I felt the least we could do is put her name out there attached to the university. And I mentioned to Claudette that I found in the archive a letter she wrote to the head librarian requesting a salary sometime in the 40s. And he wrote back that he very much appreciated her efforts on behalf of the library and that in the years that he could afford to, he would indeed pay her. So my thought about that was that maybe she should have suggested that the same arrangement work for him. Anyway, so Agnes Inglis was an unsung heroine, and I'm trying to have her be sung. Okay, so what I'm really here to talk about is advancing women in science and what we're up to at the University of Michigan. We are part of a national program that the National Science Foundation conceived of, and I want to give real credit to their vision, which is they named their program Institutional Transformation, which is what we needed to do. We needed to really transform the culture, the environment of science and engineering, and the university more broadly to make it a more inclusive environment, an environment in which women could advance. 19 institutions have received Advanced Institutional Transformation Awards, and there's a new round of awards being made again this year. Michigan got a grant in the first year, which was 2001, and they're each 5-year projects. So you're supposed to make institutional transformation happen within 5 years. So that's a neat trick if you can do it, and we're trying. So we've got about 18 months left, so we'll see if we can manage it, or at least get the momentum going, because inertia ought to keep it going, right? So the goals are to improve the institutional climate in general for tenure-track women faculty. This was a new idea that the focus should be on the faculty. There's a ton of work that's been done on the pipeline, starting with little girls and boys, starting with middle school kids, high school kids, keep people in college in the science and engineering classes, but there's been very, very little for faculty. And NSF promoted the notion, the recognition, that in 30 years of major social changes for women in this country, and there have been that, it hadn't touched the faculty in science and engineering. And that's right. I'll show you some data in a minute that makes that clear at Michigan. So the second thing is concretely that we would not just improve the climate in some kind of fuzzy way, but that we would specifically improve recruitment, retention, and promotion using hard indicators, that ought to be able to show that we were hiring more women and they were thriving, staying, continuing to produce and be successful. And finally, that women would advance to positions of authority. At the time of the initial grant, we had 1 woman in a chair position in 55 science and engineering departments campus-wide. Now, 4 years later, we have 8. That's a major change. And the one we had was not in one of the 3 big colleges, and the other 7 are. So in the College of Engineering, the School of Medicine, and the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. So we are making major changes. And I want to also say the men who are being appointed as chairs have also changed. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so the context then is the underrepresentation on the faculty in science and engineering of women. And secondly, the notion of the higher, the fewer. So not only are women underrepresented in general, but they're especially underrepresented at the top. And here's just a sample. So this is the College of LS&A Natural Science Departments. That's the liberal arts college at Michigan. And you can see that almost half of the bachelor's degrees go to women in science and engineering. So we're doing fine there, one could argue. At the master's degree level, it's above 30%. At the doctoral level, it's 30%. It was above 40% at the master's level. But then we see a pretty precipitate drop when you get to the faculty. So assistant professors, it's less than 20%, and the faculty at Michigan are largely full professors. So it's only 9 people in 2001. Okay, it's only 11 who are associate professors. Those are people with tenure, but at the early rank, only about 20%, and most painfully of all, 5% full professors. Okay, so really, really small numbers. That's a very lonely group of 8 women. So that's 8 women in 8 departments. Okay, so they are very isolated in 2001. It is a very small number of people, and as I already mentioned, they don't have leadership roles. Okay, so the situation was not wonderful looking at the numbers. So what was our strategy? And by the way, our numbers are very typical. So they look exactly the same at research universities nationally. So the Ivies, the other large research universities all look the same. And Washington, by the way, I hate to give a plug to Washington, but they have an advanced grant too, and it's a very good project. So what's characteristic of the Michigan approach? Well, the approach is data-based in a number of important senses. First of all, we decided we would start with results from a climate survey we did before NSF's money came to us. So the university funded the climate survey so that we'd be in a position to design strategies to solve problems that we could document, not to solve problems that we didn't have. That we would use the climate findings to increase awareness. So I gave 21 talks on campus to audiences of faculty about what we had found about the climate in the science and engineering departments. We had 300 people come to the launching of the project, which the president and provost presided over, as did Alice Hogan from the National Science Foundation, at which I summarized the findings from the project. So there was a very large effort to make sure a large number of people on campus were very aware of what was going on. We discussed evidence-based approaches to change from the literature, and we used data to monitor progress. It's a truism that if you don't measure it, you can't change it, and there's no question that that's right. If we don't know how many women chairs there are, we can't shock people. So when we are able to say it's exactly 1, and she's in dentistry, people are surprised. Okay. We also thought about what theoretical bases we could draw on. We drew broadly on systems theory, and that allowed us to think through the notion that we could intervene at lots of different levels and expect that changes would start to have effects. We could draw on social movement theory from political science, which tells us how to encourage an underrepresented group to strengthen its own understanding of its problems and advocate on its own behalf. And we could draw on conceptual tools from the social sciences like gender schemas, critical mass, evaluation bias, and accumulation of disadvantage. And I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. Okay, so our goal was institutional change. Whoops, breaking that down. That meant we wanted to identify problematic practices throughout the system affecting faculty. So that's hiring, evaluation, service. Are the women doing too much service? No, you won't be surprised. The answer is yes. Do they get promoted at the same rate as men? No. Do they get promoted as quickly as men? No. What can we do to change that? Are they getting as much support, the support they need, and what's the environment like? So we identified the places we needed to intervene, what beneficial practices could improve outcomes, and then try to construct institutional structures that would persist beyond this project. Okay, so I'm going to just tell you briefly about the findings from the survey. They're not surprising. They're what everybody finds, although I would be very curious whether you think they would be the same at Microsoft. So our strategy was to compare the women scientists' experience of the work environment to both male scientists and to female social scientists. The strategy here was female social scientists are, after all, female, and the construction of the field is somewhat similar. That is, they have grants, they have grant pressure, they produce research in the same kind of collaborative manner that scientists do, with somewhat less pressure for those things, but in the same general direction. So if the female social scientists and the female scientists look different, then it can't be just about women. So one of the things we were trying to head off was the possibility that people would say, well, you just can't please women, right? Any women. So we wanted to be able to tell whether things had to do with being a woman or being a woman scientist.
So the female social scientists, that was a different department?
They were other departments, but in the same college. Right. Good question. And please do ask questions if things aren't clear. What did we find? We found that the women scientists were, compared to men, more likely not to have a partner. That is, they were more likely to be single, and they were more likely, if they did have a partner, to have a partner who was employed full-time. But why does this matter? The home lives of women scientists are different from the home lives of men scientists. So that is an automatic element of difference that has consequences for how well people understand each other, what the pressures are, what the demands are in their lives. So it's just a barrier. Differences can be barriers. They don't have to be, but it's one that has to be understood. I'm not going to emphasize any of these details, but women were doing more service and they were far less likely to be mentored. We did not use the word mentoring. We asked people, who do you go to for advice? Men, women, for 8 different topics. The men were able to list lots more people they went to for advice on lots more topics. About 3 to 1, the men were getting more mentoring than the women. Overall, the women were less satisfied with their position at the University of Michigan, the women scientists. So in general, the morale pattern was that the women social scientists had the highest morale, male scientists had the next highest, and women scientists had the lowest. 40% of them were able to report that they felt they had been discriminated against in at least one area. The areas were things like salary, promotion, access to resources, and so on. This is self-report, but it was a shockingly high level. All administrators at Michigan were very disturbed to see that figure. And 20% reported that they had experienced unwanted sexual attention in the past 5 years, which is the standard definition of sexual harassment. And again, that is a very high rate. In the corporate world, it's far lower. The 20% lifetime rate is more typical. So 20% in 5 years is a very high rate. And then we had 9 scales that measured all different features of the environment, and in every case the women scientists were the most negative and the women social scientists were the least. So they reported feeling under scrutiny, feeling that they were not seen to measure up as often, that their opinion wasn't valued, and so on. So what was the implication of the findings? Well, we thought we needed to improve the experience of equity so that people were not reporting that they felt discriminated against. We needed, for example, to do a salary equity study and remedy salary inequities, which we have done. We needed to improve the work-household interface. That seemed clear. We needed to lessen the service burdens and increase the opportunities for leadership. I didn't mention this, but the women were more likely to say they were interested in leadership, though they held fewer leadership roles. Yeah.
About what was the percent difference on the salary equity?
After you control for lots of things like field and rank, about 5% to 7%, not counting the medical school. Those probably over-control because it's not random how people assort themselves into fields. So men are in the highest, more disproportionately in the highest paid fields. So there's lots of disputes about how to estimate this, but so that's a lower bound estimate. At entry, they're equal, men and women's salaries. I should point that out. So this is where we're going to come to accumulation of disadvantage. Okay, we needed to improve mentoring and we needed to improve the climates. But first, we needed to improve the critical mass. There needed to be more women. There still need to be more women. So we put a huge emphasis on recruitment. So recruitment happens at the department level. Big institution, you're trying to influence something that happens at the grassroots level, and how are we going to reach that level from what isn't the top, in the sense that advance is kind of on the side. It's not the central administration telling you what to do, but it is not at the grassroots level, and it's got a campus-wide purview. Our notion was that we would take 9 faculty who were undisputed senior authority figures in their fields of science and engineering. They would become a kind of peer team to go out and spread the word about good recruitment practices to their colleagues. So we created this committee called STRIDE, the Science and Technology Recruiting to Increase Diversity and Excellence Committee. And one of the members of the committee, our mathematician, came up with the acronym. So I think it took him a while to get those words in an order that would make that happen. The STRIDE committee is now something that is being imitated nationally quite often. And I think the key ingredients are that these are people who really have the respect and credibility to carry this kind of message to the faculty. The committee is extremely hardworking. They get a course release for doing this work. They meet every other week all year, 2 hours a week, and they do a sort of very intensive training of search committee chairs as well as lots of individual interactions with departments that are doing searches or have special problems. They also designed and prepared a handbook called Faculty Recruitment Handbook. It's also on our website, and I'll leave some copies of it here, that outlines best practices for recruitment. But they knew that just handing out a handbook wasn't going to do much. People needed to think hard about it. So they hold these workshops. Last year we trained 60 search committee chairs in 3 workshops. And the notion was that we would encourage better, equitable recruiting strategies. I want to emphasize that the naming of the committee as a committee to increase diversity and excellence was very deliberate. The first issue we needed to head off, and we understood this, was the notion that these are somehow opposites or things to trade off. So we had the same goal everybody else did in the university of maintaining the excellence of our faculty, but we were committed to the idea that we could do that while pursuing diversity too. This is the committee. I won't go over every individual, but Martha Pollack is a computer scientist. She's the third from your right, looking at it. Another engineer, Tony England, is next to her, a chemist, a geologist, a biologist, and the mathematician's in the corner, and next to him is another biologist. The two, Gary and Wayne, Gary's a biologist of some sort, and Wayne is an engineer, material science engineer. So they were drawn from the 3 biggest colleges, and that was deliberate as well. They always go in groups. They are always mixed gender. They try to be at least 3 of them plus me in every setting, so that there's different people to hear what people are really asking. Sometimes you don't hear exactly what's being asked. So they teach people about these conceptual tools: gender schemas, evaluation bias, critical mass, and accumulation of disadvantage. And they tell them about studies, and there are lots of studies of how people evaluate CVs, how people evaluate grant proposals that show the operation of unconscious bias, which I'm going to just explain to you in a second. So here's how they do it. They present this theoretical model which says we all have gender schemas, everybody, men and women. You can't escape them. We all know what they are. The schemas are much like stereotypes. They're associations we have between what it is to be female and what it is to be male. Right? So we all carry those around. And if I asked you what are those stereotypes, you could tell me. So what's a feature of the female stereotype or schema? One trait?
Nurturing.
How about the male stereotype? One trait? There you go. Okay, so we've all got them. We'd all say the same words. You can't help it. It's nobody's fault. You've just got them. Now, when there are very few of any category of a group, we are more likely to evaluate people in terms of the schema, right? We differentiate people when there are a lot of them. So when you know a lot of people from a group, you realize they're quite different from each other, and group characteristics are much less important in your thinking about them. So if you have no women in your department and you have a job candidate come in who's a woman, you're much more likely to look at her as a woman than as, say, a computer scientist, okay? So critical mass is very related to how likely it is we're going to use these schemas that we can't help having. Given that we have them, evaluation bias has been well documented. Men's competence is overvalued and women's is undervalued. If you give people the exact same information about a man and a woman, that's what happens. The exact same quality is evaluated higher for the man and lower for the woman. Hundreds of studies show this. It's nobody's fault, and men and women both do it. Okay?
Question, Dr. Stewart.
In a lot of the readings of research around tokenism, if you have less than 10% of
A
a
group.
gender or a group in a group, evidence seems to suggest that they try to blend in and lose their identity.
Correct.
Do you see this in,
Yes.
in these studies all the time?
And this, yes. So that's the effect on the token, not the
So I'm
evaluator.
wondering how that actually works in the group dynamic then, if that changes the evaluation bias.
No.
Okay.
So the effects on the token are very important,
It's a
and the
double effect,
impact,
really.
that's right, and the impact of a token who has lower power in the culture is different from the impact on a token who has higher power in the culture. There are interesting studies that show that when a white male is the only one in a group, it's very different from being a person of color or a white woman in being the token. So the impact on the person in terms of their confidence, their performance, and so on is very different depending on their power within the system. But these processes happen just based on critical mass. Okay, so evaluation bias operates. On average, women's performance is underestimated, and therefore disadvantages accumulate. So one study showed that if you assume a 1% bias against women in a system, which is a very low rate of bias, so that their salaries, for example, will always be 1%, judged to be 1% less meritorious than the men's, over a period of years, an absolutely equal system will shift so that 65% of the people in leadership positions are men. Okay, so a 1% bias will only take 8 turnovers in the system for that to happen. So bias, accumulation of disadvantage, sometimes thought of as making mountains out of molehills, is an important phenomenon. And it's why we could have equal salaries at the beginning of a career and unequal salaries 20 years later, right? Which is the pattern that we have. Okay, so if you have lowered career success, what's that going to do? It's going to feed into our gender schemas and our lack of critical mass. So we don't have to have any evil actors, evil intentions for this system to go on reproducing itself forever. Okay, so we got that on the table. That's what STRIDE does. It presents this model, this argument, this explanation, and then says, okay, if this is the case, what are we going to do about it? Because without taking action, it will reproduce itself. That's what it's been doing for 30 years. Well, longer. Well, we teach them ways to change their behavior. And here's a little evidence that the changing of behavior works. So if you take base rate as hiring about 13 or 15% of the pool being women, which is what was happening when we started the project, for the last 2 years, the prior 2 years, we hired, in fact, at 3 times that rate. And I've now looked at the data for 2 of the 3 big colleges for this past year, and it looks like we're holding the same rate. So it looks like we're continuing to hire at something much closer to 40% than 15%. Now, it's a small number of positions turning over, right? So it's not going to make a big dent in those painful numbers for a long time, but it's going to take a lot longer if we stay at 15%, right? So I'd like to get it up to 60%, but, you know, we can dream. You might want to ask, well, what practices, and I'd be happy to talk about what the practices are. It is very well known that certain practices are very destructive or increase the likelihood that we'll rely on schemas, and one of them is one academics use all the time, which is after the search, you send out an email to your colleagues and you say, what'd you think of the colleagues? And they send back a very general email. I liked this one, I didn't like this one so much, I didn't like that one so much. Okay, so instead, the workshop participants this year suggested that we give them a tool, and this is it, it's called the Candidate Evaluation Tool, which asks people to say, what did you experience of the candidate? Did you read their work? Did you go to the talk? Did you go to dinner with them? So what do you know? What have you actually experienced? And then on specific skills like potential for research productivity, research funding, collaboration, teaching, to rate each candidate. That practice dramatically changes the likelihood that women and minorities make it into pools. Okay? Just the sheer tying it down to the specifics. It moves you away from schemas. So that's just an example of some of the practices that we encourage. So global generic ratings, coming up with your top 3, bad idea. So come up with the top 3 teachers, the top 3 researchers, the top 3 funders, you'll have 6 people overall, and it'll be a more diverse pool. And that's the pool you really want to choose from. Okay, so I mentioned that we see this as a system that we can intervene lots of places. So we can be leadership driven from the top at the institutional level about policies, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. At the individual level, we knew we needed to get resources to the women. So we needed to put resources in the women's hands, and we tried to do that. And then we needed to do this intervention about climate. It was climate that seemed the hardest, and still seems the hardest. So we asked departments to apply for something we called departmental transformation grants. So we set ourselves up to be kind of a mini NSF and said, you apply to us for how you're going to change yourself. So this assumes you want to change yourself, right? So that's number one. Only those people who were willing to say they thought they should change would get this support. Secondly, they had to provide an analysis of what was going on in their department, what needs changing. And for the first time, we had departments looking back and saying, why did we have 4 failed female tenure cases in the last 10 years and no failed male cases? And actually try to figure out why. Instead of just being upset about it or embarrassed by it, to try to analyze it. So in one department, they decided the problem was when they hired women, they tended to hire women who were not really at the center of what the department does. They hired women who were kind of marginal to the enterprise. They didn't get mentored. They weren't really valued. They didn't get students. So they realized they needed either to put those structures in place or hire women closer to the center, one or the other. That's a very different situation than just feeling bad. You've got an analysis, you can fix it. So knowing that they had specific things going on that they could address changed the situation for them, and it made us invest in them. We keep these kind of theoretical ideas in the background. They're there, but we don't foreground them. That's one of our strategies. And we try to motivate people to do this kind of self-analysis and self-motivated change. Yeah?
What was the response from the departments? Were a lot of departments eager to do this, or did you have to turn people away? Or?
Yes, we did turn people down who wrote really bad proposals, and we probably had to turn a few down who wrote medium proposals, but we had a lot of proposals. Partly scientists are pretty well trained to go for money. So there's money out there, let's apply for it. So I think that's part of it. Part of it is that people honestly don't know quite why they've got the problems they've got and they would like to change. So we wanted to bet on the ones who had some kind of insight into it. So one of the things we developed in collaboration with something called the CRLT Players, which is a theater troupe, a homegrown Center for Research on Learning and Teaching theater troupe, which mostly entirely had been used up to then to train graduate students in the classroom on how to handle hard situations in teaching, including diversity-related situations. So how should they handle the tough dynamics that come up? They also are used to train them in things like how to deal with grade grubbing and other problems that new teachers have to figure out how to handle. So we asked them, could you use our sort of materials, the findings from our focus groups and interviews with women faculty, to develop sketches that would represent the experience of women faculty that we could use to foster discussion of the issues. So we have one that's on a faculty meeting. It's 5 men and 1 woman, and it's not just any old faculty meeting. It's a faculty meeting where they're discussing who to hire. And they have 2 candidates, a man and a woman, so that we can get a lot of issues on the table about what happens in that meeting. The woman gets interrupted all the time. A man says what she just said 5 minutes ago that was ignored, and he gets praised and listened to. Things that most women have experienced happen in this situation. And then there's a discussion about it. There's also one on mentoring, which we use both to train mentors and mentees on how to get good advice. We learned that many of our senior faculty have no idea what they should do when they're advising. And so to give them some ideas was important. So we also developed a handbook, which again we hand out after we have them watch painfully inadequate, inept, but very familiar career advising. And then the last one, which is still being developed and we hope to roll out in September, is a tenure committee evaluating a tenure case. And I think it's the best of them all, and they're all great. We've found that these sketches have to be framed and presented carefully. So what in the best case happens is the dean invites a group of interdisciplinary faculty, not the same department, to dinner. He talks a little bit about why he thinks this is really important. I say he because it is a he. After dinner, there's a performance of one of the sketches, and then the performers stay in character, and you get to ask them all about why they did and said what they did and said. And then there's a facilitated discussion. That has had the biggest impact of anything in terms of producing insight. People walk away saying, wow, that really looked familiar, and I never saw what it would feel like from her point of view or his point of view or whatever. So it has had a huge impact, at least in producing insight. Does it produce major change in the climate? I don't know yet. No one thing probably does. But I do know that in the one department where the department chair was willing to have the faculty meeting, which shows the department chair ineptly handling the group dynamics in his department, it was amazing how powerful it was. So what happened was a fantastic discussion went on in the meeting, or in the presentation, and he told me that for about a week there was lots of corridor talk about the sketch, and a week later people were going to him and talking to him about himself, giving him feedback about the things that they would like him to change. This was a guy very open to change, very eager to understand what he was doing wrong, and it really, really helped. So I don't think we can do that in every department. Not every department has a chair like that. But where we've got one, we've got something to work with here. Okay, we used the mentoring sketch and this handbook to ask every unit to develop a career advising plan. We stopped using the word mentoring. We discovered that people thought mentoring was a very intense, committed relationship. We all know how scared of that people are. So when we changed it to career advice, it was fine. Yes, they were happy to give people career advice. So we just don't talk about mentoring anymore, except when I give talks. Okay, and then we're planning to train faculty on these career and tenure and promotion procedures too. Okay, what about the leadership-driven projects at the policy level? And I want to say the fact that the dean took lots of dinner times to do these sketches and facilitate conversations and pay for everybody's very nice dinner was not nothing. That was also a piece of why the CRLT Players had the effect that it had. But in addition to those kinds of leadership actions, we have a committee on gender in science and engineering that is convened by the president, provost, and the executive vice president for medical affairs. That committee created 3 subcommittees that were chaired by the 3 key deans. And they looked into every policy campus-wide that affected issues of the faculty tracks, the tenure track, the research track, and the clinical track, and work family, recruitment, retention, and leadership, and evaluation and promotion of faculty. The 3 committees issued 3 reports, and we have in what we call the GSE committee, for now the subsequent year, we have been monitoring implementation of recommendations from the reports campus-wide. So major policy changes have happened. This is the distribution of people's participation on the committees. So 21 senior faculty in science and engineering served on the committees, very diverse representation. And changes that happened include things like adoption as a policy of shortlist review. So what is that? When you're deciding for a faculty appointment, how many people, which people to bring in for interviews to campus, and that's obviously the pool you're going to hire from, that list gets evaluated in the dean's office as to whether it represents the diversity in the pool of applicants, of PhDs, etc. If it doesn't, you're asked to account for it. Now, maybe you have a good reason it doesn't, but if you don't, then you better find more candidates. You're asked to do a better search. That, of course, is it's a stick you don't have to use very often, right? Because nobody wants to have to do it again. So everybody make sure that that list is okay. We had a year-long consideration of making the tenure clock more flexible. The tenure clock is very rigid at Michigan. You must come up at a certain moment, and once you're reviewed, that's it. If you don't get tenure, you're out, unemployed. Very inflexible clock. We only had leeway for a maximum of 1 year and under very restricted conditions. So we've made the clock much more flexible. You can come up early, more easily, which is something some fields have been very eager for. People who've been an assistant professor somewhere else want to come up quickly when they get to Michigan, and that wasn't easy in the past. So it's more flexible at that end, but it's also more flexible to be longer. So there are people who are very worried about this, that it's going to mean women will stay in an untenured role too long. It's a valid concern. But it is also the case that there are good reasons, I think, that we needed a more flexible clock. One of the most compelling arguments for making it more flexible was that when it was adopted 50 years ago, the tenure clock, it was a compromise between people who wanted it longer and people who wanted it shorter. There was no rationale for why it should be that long, and nobody really knew that. So we unearthed that, and people said, oh, well, maybe we could change it then. We have much more family-friendly policies, much more generous family leave. They used to be restricted to biological children, only to the mother, things like that. Now they're available to men and women, available to adopted and for adopted and stepchildren, foster children, children acquired by any means. And also for elder care. Well, maybe not kidnapping. We didn't cover that. It's also available for elder care, for personal illness, for illness in your family, any of those kinds of things. So not just children. So these are very important inclusions for making faculty with various family situations feel that their situation is not being excluded by a very narrow definition of what a family is. We have had a very active, I'll get you in one second, active dual career hiring program, and with a significant budget, more so than most universities, but we also actually pressed hard for additional staff and additional funding. Yes?
This flexible tenure clock, is this helping women more than men?
I doubt it. I think it'll help men and women equally. Generally, we think that policy changes that help everybody are a good thing. I think the present inflexible tenure clock hurts women more than men. So I think this will be helpful to everybody, and I think it is perceived to be helpful to everybody. What people are worried about is the possibility it may hurt women, and I'm worried about that too, if they end up not promoted longer, and therefore losing salary, losing a variety of things. So we will be very rigorous in following the implications of this policy.
So in what ways is it hurting women more than men?
If they actually delay, if their average time to tenure is longer than men's, for example.
I meant the existing.
The existing clock, because it's so inflexible. So if it either pushes women to avoid having children during the pre-tenure years, or to have the men take no time, which is hard. Okay, another thing we did that was very important, and I don't want to underestimate the importance of this, is we routinized the monitoring of data. The deans generally had absolutely no idea what the numbers looked like year to year. Nobody was reporting to them on any of these things. And, they're busy people. So it's not easy for them to keep track of what's really happening. So we feed them data a lot, and we have routinized the feeding of data. And in fact, in 2 of the colleges, positions have been created now. The deans found this so helpful in targeting their conversations with department chairs and so forth that they have created positions to do that, to provide them with decent data about what they needed to know. For example, no one knew were our startup packages equitable between men and women, building labs for men and women. Nobody knew. Nobody could tell. There was no data. So now we have data and we can tell, and they are equitable. At least they are now. We'll never know whether they were. The provost conducted a university-wide salary review, and the colleges now do salary reviews as often as they want, usually once a year, and they have specific pots of money set aside for equity adjustments that have to be evaluated, of course, on an individual basis. Okay, so what about providing resources to women? What are we doing there? And this speaks a little bit to your question, Revi, about the women's own feelings. How do we deal with how they feel about functioning within an environment in which they're rare? First of all, we provided them with money. We have a competitive grant program, the Elizabeth Crosby Awards, named for a neuroanatomist, Elizabeth Crosby, who never had a tenure track position, but was a world-renowned neuroanatomist at Michigan. And these awards provide research assistance, the standard kinds of things people need, but we then started opening them up. So we got requests for things like childcare for people who were going into the field and had a newborn and needed to bring a nanny. Very large costs to people early in their career that they couldn't afford. No federal funding is available for such costs. So we said, yeah, we think that's an important research-related cost that should get supported. So we provide support for things nobody can get support for. We arranged for one woman who has 3 or 4 kids in the school system who didn't want to take a sabbatical away from campus but needed to learn techniques in other people's labs. We funded her having people come to her lab so she could stay in Ann Arbor. They would come for 2 weeks and teach her the techniques. So we tried to make clear that we were prepared to be open to a wide range of proposals, and we discovered that, in fact, there are these unfunded needs out there that nobody else is taking care of. We created events that had to do with developing leadership skills, leadership interest. The biggest thing the senior women said was, you know, I'm already way too busy. I'm not sure I want to be a department chair. I've never seen a woman be a department chair. So we brought in department chairs who were women other places and gave them an opportunity to ask questions, talk about it, and some of them decided, well, maybe I do want to be department chair. So it's a way to start to see a future for yourself that is harder to imagine when there are no models. This is from the leadership retreat, this rather wild-looking picture. They had a good time. So the next thing is you have to encourage a positive collective identity. Virtually every woman that I talked to in the first year of the grant was afraid or uncomfortable or reluctant to be identified as a woman scientist. They were scientists. They didn't want to be women scientists. I mean, they were women scientists, but they didn't want to identify with that category. It was a negative identity for them. That is no longer true, and that had to stop being true if they were going to go public with their needs. If they were going to articulate what the problems are, it had to be recognized that it's different to be a woman scientist than it is to be a man. So we try to support the development of a positive identity and to encourage the women to find allies among the men in the university who are sympathetic and willing and able to advocate on their behalf with them for the things they want and need. We also tried to create some structures that will last, like peer mentoring. The women were very willing to mentor across colleges and across departments women who were isolated in other fields. Not necessarily about their science, but about everything else. There's a lot to know, and they could help with some of it. We designed the climate survey with input from the women. We gave them the first report of the findings. We asked them to tell us what didn't ring true, what were they surprised by. We've tried to keep them engaged with the project of understanding our understanding of what the issues are. And that has made a difference in them feeling comfortable that we're not going to go ahead and do things or say things they don't like or don't agree with. We've used we created a network of them. They get together 2 or 3 times a semester, and we've used that as an opportunity for them to speak to decision makers. The president has met with them twice, the provost has met with them twice, and they have an opportunity in all of those situations to interact and raise concerns about their issues. And I think they are very much heard when they do that. And they love feeling that they have the opportunity to speak directly to people at the top. Every committee, every project that we roll out involves collaboration between women and men. So nothing gets represented as entirely a women's activity. That's not entirely true. Both of the deans in engineering and LS&A asked to have advisory committees of women, just women, with no men present. And they have an advisory committee that's both men and women. Both of them felt it was really important that they hear from women in the absence of men. But they also wanted a committee that would have both men and women. So I shouldn't have said it quite so extremely. But all of our official policy-related committees are collaborative, and I think that's been very, very important to our success. I've mentioned most of these things, probably enough. And this is just the last thing I want to talk about is creating structures that will last. We've tried to figure out when somebody isn't thinking about this a lot of every day, how can we be sure that there are things in place to make sure that at least some of this continues? So within the colleges, we have done things like transform the way chairs get trained. So, for example, there's a series of seminars for new chairs teaching them how to do the budget, how to manage litigation, how to do a variety of things. Now that training is infused with issues around diversity because of what Stride really has offered them as tools. So much of the Stride project is part of the routinized chair training in both LS&A and engineering. We also have a pilot program going on right now of chair coaching, where chairs have access to coaching from someone who's a diversity specialist. She will coach them on any issue, but because she is a diversity specialist, she will always raise the diversity-related questions about whatever problem they want. So it's a case where we can provide a resource that's not just about diversity, but fold the diversity concern into it. The chairs have been extremely happy to get coaching. This was not something we were sure would be true. They make good use of it, and we think that it's something we would like to see happen campus-wide. Chairs are, selected out of a pool of human beings who don't necessarily have any administrative ability whatsoever, and giving them some support is probably a better way to implement change in the environment. I mentioned the career advising programs. We also developed a new program called Leading Excellence. The College of Engineering and the LS&A decided that the promotion to full professor, which is kind of like being vested as a partner in a law firm, was a moment that is not ritualized or recognized as really significant. And so we are now offering, and we've run the first seminar. It was very successful. I'm confident it will be created as an institutional structure. They want every new full professor to be invited to this seminar that asks them to now lift up their head above their department and think in bigger terms about the institution, that they're a steward of the institution responsible for the environment, and that they need to think about what they can do as a full professor, not as a chair, because they're not a chair, but just as a fully sort of vested person in this environment to make it a better environment for everybody. Remarkably, they were totally thrilled, grateful for this sort of attention, and the single biggest topic of their discussion that they raised over and over was, what is it we can do to shut down toxic people in the environment? So, we now know a lot of people want to. They just don't know how to. So we have to help them understand how to. Nobody knew there was this widespread a desire to do that. The other strategy here is to encourage connection across the colleges, which, those connections are always tenuous, and always it's easy not to stay connected across the colleges. So this is one moment when there's an opportunity for connection. Okay, and I mentioned the policy changes that we hope and believe will support women better. In the area of recruitment, we think that all of the practices that Stride has invented are really significant and need to keep being tended every time there are new search committee chairs. And for that reason, the provost has actually announced that he's incorporated the funding of Stride into the central budget. So it is now Michigan's Stride Committee, and it is no longer just science and engineering. I've forgotten how we changed the acronym, but scholarship, I think, something. It's now, instead of science and technology, it's something else. But we cover all fields, and we are sort of working to diversify and broaden the committee over the next 3 years as it is fully institutionalized inside the university. So that's a major university commitment to a transformed practice that should continue well past the advance grant. So that's enough of me, but I would be really interested in your questions or comments or thoughts.
What impact, or have you been able to measure an impact on the discrimination and harassment of self-reported numbers?
We don't really know yet. We're doing a repeat of the climate survey next fall of '06. We did do a quick climate survey, not covering those items, this January, as a midpoint kind of. We didn't want to overburden the respondents, so we only surveyed the women because we felt they had the most investment in it. And they do look better on all the climate indicators. Not, massively better, but better. And we were doing the survey right after Larry Summers' big flap, which I know because I got a lot of email about it, was a very painful period for many women. Lots of releasing of very negative opinions happened when he said that. So I was somewhat surprised that the results looked as good as they do. So in terms of discrimination and harassment, I don't know, but in terms of the climate in general, it looks better. We do know that discrimination and harassment are correlated, very highly correlated, with all the other climate indicators. So it ought to be better.
So early on, you had mentioned that in the process of making more women shares, also the type of men that were changing.
I didn't say anything about that. I didn't mention, but I should have, that Stride tries to reproduce itself by running a 2-day program called Faster for 15 or 20. This year it's going to be 21. Other men and women, largely men, but so the proportions are always greater men than women, where they reproduce their experience of learning this literature and encourage that group of people to become vocal allies of Stride. Interestingly, the LS&A department chairs that have been appointed since the grant all were Faster members or Stride members, so male and female. So I think they become visible leaders, and it's obvious that they know a great deal about sort of how to do this. And so I also think these deans, especially these two deans, the Dean of Engineering and the Dean of LS&A, really care about this issue. And so they're paying a lot of attention to those faculty who seem to really be committed. So it's changed both the men and the women, yeah.
You showed the slide early on showing the decline of the percentages of women from bachelor all the way to full professor. I'm curious, first, what level of transparency does the work you guys has it had on the student population, especially the graduate students? And how do you anticipate, or how has it already affected the culture within the student population?
It's a great question. So I don't think it's automatically transparent at all. I think we have to make it transparent. And we haven't done as much as I would like us to do in the next 18 months because NSF's mandate was the faculty. Increasingly, NSF has kind of loosened its grip on that and has allowed us more latitude to do things for graduate students and postdocs, who are the two communities that are the least well served at the moment. And in these departments with very few women faculty, you can bet what it's like for the graduate students and postdocs. So we are doing more and more. That's one answer. A second answer is that in the departments that do a really good job of departmental transformation, all of them have included graduate students and undergraduate students in their purview. So in several departments, we've seen really aggressive, not just making these issues transparent, but trying to open up for the first time issues that have never been discussed before, like what do I do about when a woman in my lab has a complication in her pregnancy and the funding source does not permit me any latitude to cover it. Many humane lab managers do cover it, but feel very exposed. So these issues have now surfaced and come to the fore and some lab managers, of course, are not sympathetic and don't help, but now the colleges and the university are actually thinking about, well, we better have a policy. We haven't been thinking about this, so we better think about it. This is happening nationally as well, but it has trickled up from the departments at Michigan, and it's extremely useful to have it come that way because it comes with the advocacy of a department chair who says, look, my graduate students and postdocs need to have better answers than I can give them. So that's really been helpful. So I think there's a lot more to do.
With the changes in the recruiting process and having pre-approved short lists, have you found the need at all to do any kind of interview or training and that kind of thing? Because it seems to me that could be a hole in the process.
Absolutely.
If people aren't recognizing their biases and all that.
Absolutely. So part of what the Stride workshop focuses on the visit. So we spent quite a bit of time on what should the visit look like, how should it be experienced, and the biggest and most contentious fight of this group of 9 happened when the very wonderful men on the committee said that they thought there ought to be a lot of focus and attention on the fact that the woman was a woman. And the women in the committee said, what? You're recruiting a physicist and you're going to talk to her about being a woman? You want to talk to her about being a physicist? So they had a huge 2-week thing about this, but it was great because they really thrashed it out, and the women understood that the men were well-intentioned, that, so there was no malice assumed on any side, but truly it was not obvious to the men why that was the case, that it was in fact terribly important to recruit a faculty member for her expertise and competence, and that to talk to her about being a woman was not really what she was after.
While recognizing that.
Exactly. So. Exactly. Okay, so what we did recommend is that you do set up situations like an opportunity for her to meet with the Dean's Advisory Committee on Women's Issues, and she can talk about being a woman to that group, but not to the department she's being interviewed. So that's now structured in as part of it. There's one other issue that comes up, and it goes back to the toxic person issue. Many department chair representatives or search committee chairs have said to us, what do we do about somebody that we just don't want to have them meet? So there's, that is a problem. So there might be one person who can actually make a hire not happen because he or she, hypothetically, turns off whoever the applicant is. And so we've tried to develop some strategies for them. In general, actually preventing them from meeting the person is not a good idea. What's better is to pair them with somebody else who has the weight to shut them down and the tact.
So I think that we all know that a toxic person in a small group can really destroy it. What are the policies or what practices have you put in place to help people who are in an environment with a very toxic, tenured professor?
Well, here's a case where I, tend to assume the corporate world it must be better because, tenure is this incredible protection.
So we have our own tenure system.
Okay. Well, this is part of the education of me. So, it is a very real problem, and I think the only thing that works is if the group as a group is prepared to deal with the person who's toxic. So I can speak very personally. When I came to Michigan, there was a guy in my group, and he wasn't as toxic as some can be because he did have a good heart, but he had a terrible mouth. I mean, he said unbelievably horrible things about everything. To everybody.
That's rare here. Oh, wait, sorry. You signed an NDA, right?
So all of us just ignored him, the faculty. And at some point it was made clear to me by my own students that they were really bothered by seeing him be what they thought of as rude and disrespectful to me, which had not occurred to me, that this was very, it's a blindness. So I just didn't get it. Once I understood that that was the case, I realized I actually couldn't just tolerate him, which was easier, at some level. What happened was a group of us, I spoke to several of my colleagues. I said, look, this is what's going on. And they were as willing as I was to start calling him on it every time. So, in a nice way. Knock it off, that's not okay, you can't talk that way, that kind of thing. And just every single time he did it, we conditioned him, he stopped.
Just a follow-on question. Sometimes in academia, a big name can overlook their toxicity. Since this program has started, have you seen, say, any big names that are toxic, a decision not to be made to bring them into the university because of these other pieces? So kind of an increased focus on that.
I definitely have seen that. I don't know if I would attach it to the big name, but certainly to very exciting scientists where people have heard not so good things about their colleagueship, and that's now much more on the table as an issue. I also have seen a new department chair in a department that has very serious problems and a very toxic guy is working with us. And he came in with the specific goal of either this guy changes or this guy leaves. but something has to change in this department. So there's a different will. And I do think it takes the community's will. One of the things that I saw in that department is that not only is the chair up behind it, but there are other young senior faculty who are very much behind it and who feel that this has to change or the department is not going to thrive. So I do think that it takes that. There was a hand over
Let's
here.
do about 2 more questions.
Okay.
We're going to whisk you off to lunch.
So something you said earlier actually really resonated with me because it happened twice yesterday in the same meeting where I said something and it was completely ignored, and 5 minutes later a guy picked it up and said, "Oh, hey, that's a really good idea. How about this?" And everyone's like, "Oh, that's a great idea." How do you handle that situation? What do you say? Do you call him on it? Do you say, "Hey, I said that 5 minutes ago"? Or does that sound bratty? I mean, what do you say?
Usually not. So I don't know about bratty, but it just doesn't work very well to do that. So my favorite advice on this would be pick somebody who gets it in your department or your area, whatever it is, and ask them to do that. You know, she just said that, didn't she? It is a good idea. And she said it 5 minutes ago and we didn't notice it. So get someone else to notice that this happens and have them comment on it if you can. That's the best way to handle it. Get the CRLT Players to come perform and everybody will see it. Yeah.
What has been the effect on other types of diversity?
A great question, and I'm so glad that we got to talk about that because increasingly we talk about all other types of diversity. We have always talked about race with respect to women of color, but we did an analysis of our data for both men and women of color. And we talk about race increasingly, and we are also talking more and more about sexual orientation, which frankly is the least addressed issue, especially in the sciences and engineering. So they all need to be on the table, and we try, and I didn't do a very good job of this today, but we try to talk about all those issues all the time, simultaneously to bring them up. Now, are they the same? No. So what the issues are, the remedies are different and the problems are different, but they're not completely different. They're not totally unrelated. So there are connections, and you can start to talk about where they're similar and where they're different. Specifically, one area where they're different is obviously in terms of sexual orientation, it's not visible. So that changes its nature, or not automatically visible. And in terms of race, one of the reasons NSF pushed this program for women is that the pipeline issues are more serious for faculty of color than they are for women. There are a lot of women with PhDs in these fields. There are not a lot of people of color with PhDs in most of these fields. Not all.
Well, I wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Stewart, for coming out and addressing us. And thank you all for coming. I want to put one last plug in for Dr. Stewart, but I was just out at NSF.